Welcome back, learners, to our interesting course, Rudimentary Principles and Practices of Managerial Economics. I am Dr. Shantanu Saurabh, Assistant Professor, Department of Commerce, DAV PG College, Banaras Hindu University. I welcome you all in Module 4, Lecture number 19, based on elasticity of demand. In the last lecture, we have discussed all different dimensions related to demand, exceptions to law of demand, and other topics related to demand. Now we are moving to the next topic of elasticity of demand, and in this lecture we'll be talking of basically 4 topics. First topic will be concept of elasticity of demand, the determinants of elasticity of demand, the price elasticity of demand, and fourth, degree of elasticity of demand. So the first topic, that is concept of elasticity of demand. This is one of the most interesting topic in the field of demand, in the subject of demand, as the law of demand states that there is inverse relation between the quantity demanded and the price of the commodity, which we have discussed in the previous lectures. The law states that only the direction of change in the quantity demanded is responsive to any change in the price, but it does not explain the magnitude of such change, which is the biggest drawback of law of demand. So this is where the concept of elasticity of demand comes into picture. The elasticity works in terms of percentage or proportionate change in the dependent variable, that is demand, due to a given percentage or proportionate change in the independent variable, which might be price of the commodity, income of the consumer, or price of related goods. In simple words, elasticity of demand measures the degree of change in the quantity demanded of a commodity due to the change in the price of that commodity or income of the consumer or price of the related goods. The demand for commodity changes in response to change in any one of the factors mentioned below. Thus, there are 3 concepts related to elasticity of demand. The 3 are: first, price elasticity of demand, income elasticity of demand, cross elasticity of demand, and these are 3 major types which we are going to discuss in this upcoming lecture. Now we'll be covering the next topic, that is related to determinants of elasticity of demand. The first determinant being nature of commodity. The elasticity of demand depends on the nature of the commodity being consumed. Commodities that are essential or considered necessities, such as salt, flour, etc., tend to be inelastic. This is a point to be remembered. The products or the commodities which are necessities are inelastic in nature because the consumer needs them regardless of any change in the price. On the other hand, the luxurious goods such as cars, gems, etc., have more elastic demand because the consumers can easily postpone or forego their purchasing when there is a rise in the price. This was regarding the nature of the commodity and its impact on the elasticity. The next point is income of the consumer. The income of the consumer also determines the elasticity. For example, for consumers with high income, the elasticity is less elastic because any rise or fall in the prices will not have much effect on the quantity demanded by them. Whereas in the case of consumers with low income, the elasticity of demand will be more elastic, as any rise or fall in the price of the commodity will have a significant effect on the quantity demanded. Moving further to the next point, presence of the substitutes. Commodities which have substitutes will have more elastic demand. Commodities which have substitute will have more elastic demand as compared to the commodities without any substitute. This is because of the fact that any change in the price of one commodity will bring change in the demand for another alternative commodity. So consumers easily shift to another commodity, substitute goods, if there is any change in the price of one good. Moving to the next point, several uses of the commodity. The elasticity of demand also depends on the number of uses the commodity has. If the commodity has multiple use, the demand will be more elastic, and if the commodity has only single use, then the demand will be less elastic. For instance, electricity has multiple uses, and if the price of the electricity falls, then the demand will be more elastic because it will be used for various purposes such as cooking also. The next point, postponement of the use of the commodity. If the use of the commodity can be postponed or transferred for future period, then the elasticity of demand will be elastic, which means if the use of the commodity can be postponed, it will be elastic in nature. For instance, the purchase of a television, if the price rises, the consumer will postpone his decision to purchase and will wait for the price to fall. On the other hand, if the consumption of a commodity cannot be postponed, then the elasticity will be inelastic. If it cannot be postponed, the elasticity will be inelastic in nature. For example, the purchase of food or medicine cannot be postponed. The consumers will continue to buy them irrespective of any change in the prices. The next point, that is joint demand. The elasticity of demand also depends on two goods used jointly. Goods such as bread and butter, car and petrol can be termed as joint demand, which are used jointly. Thus, the elasticity of demand of one commodity is related to the elasticity of demand for another commodity. If the demand for butter is inelastic, then in that case the demand for bread will also be less elastic. The next point is habits of the consumer. The demand for a commodity will be inelastic if the consumer is habitual of its consumption. Some people are habitual of consumption of certain goods, so that demand will be inelastic in nature. Next point is ratio of income and expenditure. Commodities on which a consumer spends a small amount of his income have inelastic demand as compared to those commodities which he spends a larger portion of his income. For instance, consumers usually spend a large amount on their income on clothes. Thus, demand for clothes will be highly elastic. Now, moving to the most interesting and important point of this elasticity of demand, that is price elasticity of demand. The price acts as a commanding factor in determining the quantity demanded. The price elasticity of demand is sometimes used as a synonym for elasticity of demand. Different economists have defined price elasticity as follows. In the words of J. M. Keynes, the elasticity of demand is a measure of the relative change in quantity to relative change in price. And in words of Alfred Marshall, the elasticity of demand may be defined as the percentage change in quantity demanded to percentage change in the price. The price elasticity of demand can be expressed as the rate of change in quantity demanded of a commodity in response to any change in the price of the commodity, holding all other determinants or factors as constant. In other words, price elasticity of demand is the percentage change in the quantity demanded of a commodity divided by percentage change in the price of that commodity. Understanding the elasticity of demand is crucial for business and policy makers as it helps them to predict how changes in price will affect their total revenue, consumer behavior and market dynamics, which means the elasticity of demand is a very important element for business houses to understand the market and frame policies accordingly. The formula for measuring price elasticity of demand is, as you can see, the percentage change in the quantity demanded upon percentage change in price. As you can see the formula, the coefficient of price elasticity of demand, the delta Q, which represents change in quantity demanded, delta P, which represents change in price of the commodity, Q, which represents original quantity demanded, and P, which represents original price of the commodity. Altogether, the motive is to understand the percentage change in quantity demanded upon percentage change in price. Now, we are going to discuss the next point, which is related to the degree of elasticity of demand. The price elasticity of demand varies from one commodity to another. Some commodities are more sensitive to change in the price than others. Economists have expressed the price elasticity of demand in numerical terms in order to explain the degree of elasticity. This numerical value lies between 0 to infinity. This is very important. The numerical value of elasticity of demand will lie between 0 to infinity. On the basis of magnitude of the elasticity coefficient, different degrees for price elasticity of demand can be described as: first, perfectly elastic demand, perfectly inelastic demand, unitary elastic demand, relatively elastic demand, and relatively inelastic demand, which we are going to discuss now. The first is perfectly elastic demand. The demand is said to be perfectly elastic when there is infinite increase or decrease in the quantity demanded of a commodity as a result of small fall or small upsurge in the price of that commodity. In other words, a small change in the price leads to an infinite change in the quantity demanded. In a perfectly elastic demand scenario, consumers are extremely sensitive to price changes, and they will only buy the good at a specific price, and any increase in the price will result in zero quantity demanded. In such a case, the demand is infinity. The slope of the demand curves depicts the elasticity of demand. The flatter the slope, the higher the elasticity of demand. This is very important. The flatter the slope, the higher represents the elasticity of demand. So, in perfectly elastic demand, the elasticity is infinity in nature. The graph of perfectly elastic demand, as can be seen in the above figure, the figure which has been represented, the demand curve DD is a horizontal line and is parallel to the x-axis, which has been shown is parallel to the x-axis. At price OP1, the demand is infinite. However, even a small change in the price will reduce the quantity demanded to 0. The demand curve is perfectly elastic because consumers are willing to purchase any quantity of good at the given price, but none at any other price. This type of demand is theoretical and typically not encountered in real world market. This is very important, that it is kind of theoretical in nature. It implies that consumers have perfect information, perfect substitutes, and are perfectly rational in their decision making. So, elasticity of demand here is infinite. Relatively elastic demand. The demand is said to be relatively elastic when the proportionate change in quantity demanded of a commodity is greater than the proportionate change in the price of the commodity. In other words, the consumers are relatively responsive to the change in price. The products with substitutes have elastic demand, and consumers can easily switch to other alternatives if the price changes. For instance, if the price of the commodity decreases by 10% and the quantity demand increases by 20%, then the demand is said to be relatively elastic demand, and the elasticity is greater than 1. Graph of relatively elastic demand. As you can see in the figure, DD is the demand curve. At the price OP1, the quantity demanded is OQ1. When the price falls from to OP2, when the price is falling, you can see the quantity demanded increases from OQ1 to OQ2. The proportionate change in quantity demanded from OQ1 to OQ2 is relatively greater than the proportionate change in the price of OP1 to OP2, so elasticity of demand is greater than 1. Unitary elastic demand, the elasticity is 1. The demand is said to be unitary elastic when the proportionate change in quantity demanded of a commodity is equal to the proportionate change in the price of that commodity. Any change in the price makes the quantity demanded change in such a way that the total revenue remains constant. This is very important. In other words, an increase in revenue from selling more units at lower prices is negated by decrease in revenue from selling fewer units at higher prices. For example, a 10% increase in the price of the commodity leads to a 10% demanded of that commodity. In case of unitary elasticity, the demand elasticity is 1 and the resultant curve is a rectangular hyperbola. This is important and has to be remembered. The demand curve is rectangular hyperbola in nature. The graph of unitary elastic demand, as you can see, the DD is the demand curve. As price OP1, at price OP1, the quantity demanded is OQ1. When the price falls to OP2, the quantity demand increases to OQ1 to OQ2. The proportionate change in quantity demanded from OQ1 to OQ2 is equal to the proportionate change in the price from OP1 to OP2. So the elasticity of demand is equal to 1. So the proportionate change in the price is equal to the proportionate change of quantity demanded. The next, relatively inelastic demand, where the elasticity is less than 1. The demand is said to be relatively inelastic when the proportionate change in quantity demanded of a commodity is less than the proportionate change in the price of that good. The relative inelastic demand shows the consumers are not very responsive to the changes in the price of the commodity. In such a case, the demand is less than 1. The slope of demand curve is relatively steep, showing the change in price leading to relatively small change in the quantity demanded of that commodity. As can be seen in the figure, DD is the demand curve. At price OP1, the quantity demanded OP1, the quantity demanded is OQ1. When the price falls to OP2, the quantity demand increases from OQ1 to OQ2. However, the proportionate change in quantity demanded from OQ1 to OQ2 is less than the proportionate change in the price from OP1 to OP2. So the elasticity of demand is less than 1. Perfectly inelastic demand, in which the elasticity is 0. The demand is said to be perfectly inelastic when there is no change in the quantity demanded of a commodity with a change in the price of that commodity, which means there is no change. Under such a situation, the consumers are totally insensitive to any change in the prices and the quantity demand remains constant in this case. In this case, the elasticity is 0 and the slope of the demand curve is vertical. The vertical demand curve indicates that the quantity demanded is same at all different prices. The situation of perfectly inelastic demand arises for those goods which have no substitute. This is important, which have no substitute and are necessary for daily consumptions or functioning, which have been shown through this diagram. the graph of perfectly inelastic demand where elasticity is 0. As can be seen in the diagram, DD is the demand curve. The DD is the demand curve at price OP1. The quantity demanded is OQ1. When the price falls to OP2 as you can see in the figure, there is no change in the quantity demanded. There is no change in the quantity demanded and it remains unaffected at OQ1. So the elasticity of demand here is 0. The summary of degree of price elasticity of demand, where you can see in the leftmost corner we have represented degree of price elasticity, their numerical value, their description and their demand curve. In the first case, in the case of perfectly elastic demand, where the demand is infinite, the change in the quantity demanded is infinite at a given level of price, and the important thing is that the demand curve here is horizontal. In the second case, in the relatively elastic demand, where elasticity is more than 1, the change in quantity demanded is more than change in price, and the demand curve is flatter in nature, which we have discussed in the lecture in the previous slides. In the third case, related to unitary elastic demand, the elasticity is exactly 1. The change in quantity demanded is exactly equal to the change in the price, and the demand curve is rectangular hyperbola. In the fourth case, you can see relatively inelastic demand, the elasticity is less than 1 and the change in the quantity demanded is less than the change in price, and the demand curve is steeper in nature. And in the last case, perfectly inelastic demand, the elasticity is 0, which means there is no change in the quantity demanded even if there is change in the prices, and the demand curve here is vertical in nature. So I tried to provide you a gist of degrees of price elasticity of demand. So that's all. I'll just provide a brief gist whatever we have discussed in this lecture. In this lecture, we tried to cover these 4 topics: the concept of elasticity of demand, determinants of elasticity of demand, price elasticity of demand, and degree of elasticity of demand. I discussed with you what the concept of elasticity of demand in detail, and then I explained you the price elasticity of demand. The other 2 elasticity, that is income and cross, will be discussing in the upcoming lecture. The determinants of elasticity of demand, that is nature of commodity, income of the consumer, presence of substitutes, several uses of commodity, postponement of the use of commodity, joint demand, habits of the consumer, ratio of income and expenditure. Then we discussed about the price elasticity of demand, its formula which you are able to see. Then finally the most important, the degree of elasticity of demand, where in brief we discussed perfectly elastic demand, perfectly inelastic demand, unitary elastic demand, relatively elastic demand, and relatively inelastic demand. All these we have discussed with proper diagrams and tables. And finally, I tried to provide you a summary of degree of price elasticity of demand with the representation of their demand curve. So that's all for this lecture from my end. I hope the lectures must be for a sense of information for you, and you will be implementing it in your practical life. Thank you all of you, and we'll be catching up in the upcoming lectures. Thank you.